Why is the national debt a bigger issue now than it was in the past? Is it a problem that people making minimum wage can't afford a two-bedroom apartment? And what is the economic rationale behind gift cards? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the gift card shelf at Walmart, surrounded by other people second-guessing which restaurant chain someone they barely know might enjoy. The national debt, we've talked about it before. We will probably keep talking about it again because the problem only is going to get worse. It is probably the most predictable problem that our government has ever faced, yet it refuses to face it. One person who's been sounding the alarm about this entirely predictable problem for many years now is Brian Riedl. He's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he is the recent author of the cover story for Reason magazine about the national debt. And so we're going to talk about that with Brian today. Thanks so much for being with us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So, this has been a problem forever. As I said, it has been an issue that people have been warning about for a very long time. And so it can sometimes be difficult to work it into the news. What was the occasion that led you to be able to write a cover story about this for Reason?
Reason approached me a couple months ago to do a cover story as they were concerned with the latest deficit numbers that are going to hit $2 trillion this year. I remember there was a lot of sticker shock when we had $1 trillion deficit for the first time during the Great Recession. And that was just temporary. It was recession-based. And then not only did we hit $1 trillion again a couple of years ago, but then the pandemic brought it to $3 trillion. And now, even in so-called peace and prosperity, it looks like we are locked into $2 trillion deficits as the minimum peace and prosperity level. And it was the 2 trillion figure that got the attention of Reason magazine and said, things are dramatically worsening on the debts and not enough people are talking about it.
Yeah, this is a point that I've made before, that in the past, as you mentioned, we had things like a recession that would cause a big deficit. We'd have things like a war that would cause a big deficit. And what happens with those kind of deficits is that the problem that led to them eventually ends, and then the deficit also ends, or at least it reduces. We saw this with the end of the Cold War, for example. Spent lots of money in the last couple of years of the Cold War. Soviet Union fell. And then in the mid-90s, we had a budget surplus. So this is something that has happened many times in our country's past. And so I think a lot of people, sometimes they hear people talking about the deficit and they go, oh, yeah, well, it might be bad this year, but that's because of something, and then it'll go down next year. That's not what we're talking about anymore. And we're at a situation now where the deficit is just going to keep going up because of factors that have nothing to do with the business cycle and have nothing to do with world affairs.
Yeah, I mean, we've had big debts before. During World War II, the debt went from about 20% of GDP to 106% of the economy, which we'd never seen before. But the war ended. And over the next 40 years, the debt fell to 24% of GDP. It didn't fall because we were running budget surpluses. It fell because we were running minuscule budget deficits at a time where the economy was growing quickly due to rebuilding after World War II and a huge influx of women and baby boomers into the workforce. That's okay. You can have deficits during wars, recessions, pandemics, as long as you have the fiscal space to run those deficits. And you don't have space to do that when you're running deficits of $2 trillion during peace and prosperity. And it's going to get worse because if you take a baseline that assumes the continuation of the government as it looks today, which means we're going to assume the tax cuts are extended, we're going to assume that discretionary spending stays at its current share of GDP, you have a deficit going to $4 trillion within a decade. And then if you assume interest rates don't come back down, and you assume higher interest rates, you're looking at deficits of about $4.5 trillion a decade from now. And that's under peace and prosperity. That's just the normal baseline before you've added in everything Trump and Harris are promising. At that point, you're looking at a deficit of about 9% of the economy during peace and prosperity, when really it needs to be 3% or lower in order to stabilize the debt.
And so what you're talking about is the ratio between the debt and national economic product, or the GDP,
Yep.
right? So there's two ways to make this ratio change. One is to reduce the debt, and the other one is to grow the GDP faster. So you're talking about how after World War II, the GDP was growing pretty quickly as well, in addition to the deficits being relatively small, and so that helped that ratio to come way down. We have in the past had politicians who at least talked about debt reduction, and at least talked about it as a goal of the government to spend responsibly, to try to live within its means, and sort of convolutedly, that was more of a talking point when the debt was less of a problem. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the points you make in your reason piece. You say we have now a debt problem that is spiraling out of control, and now at this point, politicians in both parties and basically across the political spectrum are promising to do nothing about it.
Yeah, that's the paradox that I sought to address in my article, which is the bigger the deficit gets, the less politicians and voters seem to care, which doesn't make any sense, except for the fact that when the deficit was smaller in the 80s and 90s, it was a decent size as a percentage of the economy, but not as big as today. It was actually not that hard to fix the deficit. We had the end of the Cold War, which allowed a huge reduction in defense spending. And from there, it really only took some targeted tax hikes, modest tweaks, and just not doing any new big spending programs to balance the budget by 98. In other words, back then, politicians could promise an easy target, a balanced budget, that was relatively achievable without an impossible amount of pain. Today, the deficit is $2 trillion a year. And not only is it too big, but it's driven almost entirely by Social Security and Medicare deficits, which politicians don't want to touch. So now you can't balance the budget. A politician cannot promise a balanced budget. You're not going to get rid of a $2 trillion deficit. The best you can do is just to try to keep the debt at 100% of GDP. That's not an exciting goal for voters. Not only is it not an exciting goal, but it's a goal that you really can't achieve without some combination of significant reforms to Social Security and Medicare and increases in middle-class taxes, which no one wants to talk about. So when politicians are faced with, do I want to do the most unpopular policies possible when it's not even going to fully balance the budget, they just say, forget it. It's not worth the pain.
So we talk about the debt to GDP ratio. You said, it's around 100% right now, and you're going to try to keep it there.
Yeah.
Countries like Japan, for example, they have debt to GDP ratio in excess of 200, 250%. Japan has had economic problems, obviously, but it still exists. It's still a country. It's still a wealthy country. Why should we be concerned about the ratio around 100% when there are other countries that have higher ones?
It's a great question. First, just to look at what the United States is dealing with. Again, we peaked at a debt at 106% of GDP at the end of World War II. From that point to 2008, it averaged about 40% of GDP, which was pretty stable. Now it's 100. Over the next 30 years, we're going to about 240% of GDP just to keep current policies. And if interest rates rise, we're looking at 300 to 350% of GDP. In terms of comparisons with other nations, really there's just Japan. Italy, Greece are up into 130s, 140s. Most of Europe is about 100 or below. It's really just Japan that has really pushed over that level and gotten well into the 200s. First off, Japan's an economic basket case. As you mentioned, their economy has been relatively stagnant for 30 years. That being said, they've been able to handle it without a debt crisis Because Japan has an enormous savings rate. So it's easy for the government to borrow money without taking away money from investment, without raising interest rates, because in Japan alone, corporate retained earnings, which is basically the amount of money corporations save rather than investing or spending, is nearly 100% of their GDP. It's that big. It equals nearly 100% of their economy. So corporations are just sitting on piles of money they don't know what to do with. So they lend it to the government. That makes it somewhat more manageable. But I would also add, not only does Japan have the advantage of a huge savings rate, they achieved much of their deficits through a steady structural deficits of about 6-7% of the GDP every year. They didn't go on the steep, rapid growth we are, where deficits are going to 10, 12, 14, 16% of GDP. Theirs was more of a slow burn, not as sharp as we're facing. And when it's that sharp, it destabilizes the financial markets even more. So we don't want to be like Japan's economy. We don't have the savings rates to do Japan, finance like Japan. And ours is growing steeper than Japan's ever did. Our debt is.
Yeah, that's scary. What else is scary is something that you have written about in the past as well, which is interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
The Congressional Budget Office, when it makes these projections, assumes that interest rates are going to be pretty steady and pretty low by historical standards. And so if those interest rates go up basically at all of these numbers get significantly worse. Can you walk through a little bit about how interest rates play into this?
Yeah, in 2020, when interest rates were extraordinarily low, I wrote a 10,000 word report on how interest rates are the biggest threat we have to fiscal solvency. And I got laughed at. Interest rates are low. They're never going to rise. They've been falling for 30 years. This is Chicken Little. I'm not being called Chicken Little too much now after what we've seen. The danger is this. We have essentially gambled our fiscal future on the hope that interest rates never exceed 4% again. What I mean by that is the government is on pace to borrow as much as $120 to $170 trillion over the next 30 years. The debt right now is about 30 trillion. It's going to go to 200 trillion. When you owe that much money, even a small change in interest rates on a debt that big can break you. And the Congressional Budget Office assumes that the interest rate paid on the debt will average 3.5% over the next decade and never achieve 3.8% over the next 30 years. Well, the latest bond auctions for the new auctions for new treasury debt have been 4.5. So the idea that interest rates are going to stay that low for 30 years seems extremely naive, especially when there's a lot of economic factors that are going to push interest rates up, such as the debt itself. Big government debt by itself pushes up interest rates. So what we're facing is, if interest rates rise even 1 point higher than the CBO assumption, say instead of 3.8 over 30 years, it's 4.8 over 30 years, you have to add $35 trillion in interest costs over 3 decades. That's per point. How much is that? That's nearly the cost of adding another Defense Department. So think of it this way. Every time interest rates rise by 1 point and sustain themselves, it will cost as much over 30 years as adding another Defense Department. That's how the debt goes from 230% of GDP in 30 years up to 280 or 300% of GDP. Again, we've essentially gambled our fiscal future on the hope that interest rates never rise. And if they do, there's going to be all sorts of weird political incentives for Congress and the White House to try to force the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates and force interest rates down in order to prevent a debt crisis. And that'll only cause hyperinflation.
So investors in the bond market, you mentioned treasury auctions. They obviously have to go out and buy these securities. At what point do they look at this and say, this is ridiculous. We're not going to buy this. You guys clearly aren't going to pay us back. There's no possible way that and if you do pay us back, it's going to be an inflated currency. So in order to justify us buying this bond, you're going to have to give us a much higher yield.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the numbers, again, we're looking at borrowing, anywhere from about 120 to 170 trillion dollars over the next 30 years. The government's going to have to. Where are we going to borrow that money from? China and Japan each only hold $1 trillion of American debt, and they're trying to get rid of it. The Federal Reserve holds $4 trillion, and they don't want to hold too much more because that brings inflation. You're essentially monetizing debt. So that means we're going to have to borrow upwards to $150 trillion from America's savings markets, the bond market, Wall Street, mutual funds, insurance funds, state and local governments, savings bonds. How are we going to borrow $150 trillion over 30 years from these individuals at low interest rates? Not only is it just a huge amount to borrow, if there's and as you know, the law of demand, when you increase the demand of money, the price of money goes up. That's the interest rate. That's going to push up interest rates. So not only does supply and demand push up interest rates, but as you mentioned, default risk gets priced into interest rates at some point. Investors are going to demand higher interest rates to compensate for the risk that the federal government can't fully pay for this or that they're going to inflate it. The default risk is going to push up interest rates as well. So even if we can borrow $150 trillion from domestic investors, which, by the way, would leave very little money left over for home loans, business loans, and car loans, it's going to have to be in much higher interest rates just because of the law of demand and default risk. And the Wall Street Journal is already reporting on this. They did an article a couple months ago that said Wall Street is not sure they can handle the demands for all the new money Washington wants to borrow. It's really going to stretch our financial markets thin. And like I said, China and Japan aren't going to bail us out. They're too small. And the Federal Reserve doesn't want to bail us out because that's monetizing and inflating us away.
Yeah, and just so we're clear, listeners, Brian is saying that the second largest economy in the world and the fourth largest economy in the world are too small. Are too small to solve this problem. That's the really crazy part of this. We really haven't seen anything like this as a country. This is different. This is truly different than past deficits. And Brian has been one of the top people making the case that this is something that we should care about. He's only going to look more right as the years go on because that's just how math works. Mm-hmm. And that's where we're at right now. Politicians are basically denying basic mathematics. So thanks so much for talking about this with us, Brian, and we'll be sure to probably have you on at some point in the future as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Senator Bernie Sanders, known for his economic pronouncements, though not necessarily for his economic expertise, put out on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, and said there is not a single state in America where you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment while earning the minimum wage. Something is wrong with this picture. No more excuses, tax billionaires, raise the minimum wage, and build more affordable housing. So obviously housing prices are a problem. We've seen a huge increase in housing prices in recent years, and housing, the house that many people would like to buy is in some cases out of reach for them. But this particular version of this complaint is rather unusual. What Sanders is saying is that if you're making the minimum wage in any state, you can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Before we even get to the housing part of this, though, his complaint is already sort of taken care of by the minimum wage part. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps track of minimum wage. They put out a report every year on minimum wage workers. The 2023 edition found that only 1.1% of American workers make the minimum wage. So 1.1% make the minimum wage to begin with. So right away, we're talking about a population that does not include 99% of American workers. Again, this is of workers, not of the total population. So that should sort of make us skeptical right from the start, because if this problem doesn't really affect 99% of people, that's sort of unusual. You hear progressives a lot of times will talk about the minimum wage as though lots of people make it, and that's just not true. But then if we dig down even deeper into the data, we can find that of the people who make the minimum wage, which again is only 1% of people, but of those people, about half of them, 44%, are below the age of 25. So if someone is below the age of 25 and they're making the minimum wage, what does that probably tell you about them? Probably means they are a teenager with a side job, maybe a summer job. Maybe they're working full time, but it's only in the summer because they'd be in school otherwise. It could be someone who has a job in addition to another job. And for a lot of people under 25, they are living with relatives, whether it's their parents or their grandparents, maybe with other siblings. They're probably living with someone else. So they're probably not in the market for a 2-bedroom apartment. We can just sort of intuit that based on, somebody under the age of 25 who is making the minimum wage. They're probably not in the market for a 2-bedroom apartment. So the fact that they can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment just isn't a problem for them. It's even more so when you look at the fact that about half, again, of workers who make the minimum wage are working part-time. It is not their full-time job. So someone working part-time at the minimum wage is just not making a lot of money in general. They can't afford lots of things. And that's probably not a problem. Again, they're probably a young person who is financially dependent on others. And so before you even get to the housing component of Sanders' complaint, we've already established that we're basically talking about a group of people who don't exist. People who work full-time at the minimum wage and are in the market for a 2-bedroom apartment. I'm sure you can find someone like that in the United States, but there's not very many of them. And the idea that we should make national policy that affects 100% of the people based on a population that really doesn't exist is a pretty good indication of the soundness of Sanders' proposals and analysis here. So another economic area that I was interested in recently, and sort of just wanted to take a detour from current events to break down for you, is the economics of gift cards. We think of gift cards as a very normal part of gift giving. I'm sure most of us have received and given gift cards at various points in our life. Probably have a couple right now. That's a point we'll get to later on. But gift cards, if you think about them, don't make a lot of sense. Because think about what a gift card is. It's basically money, but worse. Money is a medium of exchange that you can use to purchase goods and services. A gift card is a medium of exchange that you can use to purchase goods and services at one place. And if you have a gift card for Wendy's, you can't take it to McDonald's to pay for something. Whereas if you had the exact same amount of money, you could use it at Wendy's or McDonald's. Or you don't have to spend it on food at all. You could spend it on something else entirely, something that you needed. So gift cards are really just a less flexible form of money. They don't save you any money. When you're buying, it's not like the price is lower if you buy it with a gift card as opposed to buying it with money. So it doesn't make a difference to the price. It's just a different way of paying for something that is less flexible and therefore just a little bit worse than if you just had the same amount of money. Yet we have lots and lots of gift cards. So What's going on here? Well, because of social norms that have developed over time, we've decided that giving people money as a gift is not very thoughtful. It's not a very good gift. And you can understand the logic behind this. You're supposed to try to tailor your gift to the person receiving it, showing that you put some thought into it, had some interest in their preferences and kinds of things that they might like to have. And so just giving them money is sort of a cop-out of that portion of gift giving. Now, this is a joke about economists going back many years. The idea that economists are just stumped by why we don't just give people money as gifts, because obviously money is better because you can use it to buy whatever you'd like. But I think we all know that's not the only purpose of gift giving. It's also part of you expressing as the giver what you know and care about that other person. And so gift cards, again, are basically money, but they're a perfectly acceptable gift. So they solve a problem. The problem that they solve is the problem of you needing to give a gift to someone you don't know that well. This problem pops up a lot. You get invited to somebody's birthday party. They are, a friend of a friend, or someone that you just have maybe not been in touch with for a while. You have to get them a gift. What are you going to get them? A gift card. That's a great solution. It's also a good solution for an aunt or uncle who lives across the country, maybe, and wants to give their niece or nephew a birthday present. Maybe they, talk to them on the phone a couple times a year. They don't know them that well, and so you can give them a gift card. Now, of course, a gift card is also kind of seen as a cop-out gift. And it would be a cop-out gift if you gave a gift card to your spouse as a present, or if you did that to someone else that you know really, really well. But for people you don't know that well, and let's be honest, there's lots of people you don't know that well that you might need to give a gift to, the gift card is a great option. It allows you to give money without giving money. That's the problem that gift cards solve. But again, as I said before, the price doesn't change when you pay with a gift card versus when you pay with money. So the store doesn't really care either. It adds up on their bottom line just the same. So why do stores sell gift cards? Well, one reason is that there is this gap in the market that gift cards fill. So that's one reason. But another reason is that stores actually do make money on gift cards. If someone buys you a gift card and then you go spend the whole gift card, it's just a wash for the store. It's no different than if you went there and spent it and spent that exact same amount of money. It just sort of changes the time order in which the payment happens, right? You get a $25 gift card. The person giving the gift paid the store $25. Then when you spent it, the store gave you $25 worth of stuff. So it just sort of changes the time in which that happens. But from the store's perspective, it's the same. They got $25 in exchange for $25 worth of product that they sold. But how stores actually make money off gift cards is when you don't spend all of the money. And I'm sure you probably have a gift card right now that you might have had for a year, 2 years, or maybe you don't think you have a gift card that you've had for 1 or 2 years, but you actually forgot you have it, and you're going to discover it later tonight when you go home and open a drawer you haven't opened in a while, or dig around in a bag that you haven't looked too closely in, something like that. That's how stores end up making a lot of money off of gift cards, because when you add that up across the entire United States, estimates are that there is about $20 billion worth of unspent gift cards out there. So that's a great deal for stores, right? So if someone buys a $25 gift card and gives it to you and you never spend it, that means the store got $25 in exchange for no products in return. Now, that's a good deal for the store. So stores will keep offering gift cards and bank on you not using them. Now that sort of feels icky, right? Because it's kind of like they're taking money in exchange for nothing in return. But it's really not any different than if somebody buys you an actual gift and then you don't use it. Someone buys you an actual gift and you sort of are respectful and say thank you, but then end up just putting in a corner somewhere and maybe a closet and you never actually use it. That's the same thing as not using the gift card. In that case, the store got the money for the product, but the product's not actually doing anything out there in the world. It's exactly the same thing with the gift card. And so this isn't really an issue for stores. And it's not really a moral issue for stores to be, issuing a product and sort of counting on you not using it. As always with gifts, it's the thought that counts. It's just that sometimes those thoughts are not very well informed. And so sometimes gifts don't end up doing what they were intended to do. That's no different than any other product. There's lots of times that we buy things intending them to do one thing and then we end up being wrong. And it ends up not being useful at all. That's not the store's fault. It's not your fault either. It's just the kind of thing that happens when people make decisions and trial and error their way to better outcomes. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show and makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Brian pick the paper of the episode from the Manhattan Institute in August of 2024 by Chris Pope, The Overextended Retirement State. Here's Brian to tell you about it.
A new paper by my colleague at the Manhattan Institute, Chris Pope, is called The Overextended State. And what Chris did is it took a look at spending and taxes that families face over a lifetime. And what he determined is that essentially for all the talk that the federal government transfers money from the rich to the poor, really the federal government just transfers money primarily from young people to old people. The vast majority of federal spending goes from workers to retirees, who, by the way, are richer often than the workers paying the taxes. So we are redistributing money upward. We're not spending as much money on kids, and we're not spending as much money on the poor as we are spending money on rich old people. And as deficits go through the roof and we face a fiscal reckoning, it may be time to revisit why we decided that the wealthiest generation and the wealthiest age group in American history should be the biggest recipient of government spending. Again, it's called The Overextended State by my Manhattan Institute colleague, Chris Pope. You can get it on the Manhattan Institute website.
The Overextended Retirement State by Pope. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.